I think batteries is the best way forward. If they ever had like a rechargeable internal battery, it would have made this worse. I think you can find more power in a smartwatch than you can find in a Game Boy. Solid Mind here, and today we are asking the question, should you buy the original Game Boy in 2024? I had a quick look, and today, as I record this video, I can buy a Game Boy, the original one, for between £110 for like a bad quality one to £190 for a slightly good quality version. So these have gone up in price. It does make sense. It's retro gaming. It's not the cheapest, but emulation devices, like the R36S retro handheld is around 50-60 pounds, so you can get emulation devices for around 50-60-70 pounds. You can get them for even 300-400 pounds. So emulation you can get cheaper and more expensive and more newer, but to get the authentic element, it does cost a little bit, like in the middle, like 150, maybe 200. But should you buy it? Let's find out.
From like an NES or Super Nintendo controller, but I found that it is more mushy than I was expecting. What that means is that it's a little bit harder to press down on that rubber membrane, and then additionally it doesn't spring back as quick.
Yeah, so I guess this is the original, I guess, Game Boy came out in 89, 90, around that time. Um, so it's pretty old. So trying to buy an authentic original unit, wear and tear is gonna happen. Yes, the emulation devices now have new features like springs, and because they're much newer, things are more clickier. But this is what you get when you go for the authentic element of it.
As I thought it would be either. When playing a more modern retro handheld, something like an Anbernic device, they have a different feel to them. Yes, they're using a rubber membrane connection, but it's softer and more responsive. And so because of that, I actually think the more modern gamepads just feel a little bit tighter. But
they do feel tighter, but you have to understand, like, this is like 30 years old. This is 20 years old, depending on the year you buy it. It's not meant to be. So technology with time advances rapidly. If you use maths, think of an e-graph, exponential graph. So exponential is more like it goes here, then it shoots up. It's quite a hockey stick elevation or evolution in terms of, technology. So our knowledge about everything has hockey sticked up. It's gone from like a little bit to like substantial knowledge in terms of even like how to make the D-pad feel better and the buttons feel more clicky. And so you can't compare them. It's like apples and oranges. They're different fruits. They're still fruits, but they're different.
But all the same, as soon as I got my hands on this old school D-pad, I totally felt that difference and remembered how it used to be. Now, the face buttons are very similar as well. They have a rubber membrane connection and will push down in that kind of classic retro way. But I found with my Game Boy DMG, they don't spring up as quickly as I was expecting. Again, this could be just because we're using some older rubber membranes right here, or it just may be.
Exactly. It's about the age. But that's the thing. If you want to play retro games on a newer device, there is cheaper units that have, unfortunately, better feel than the original Game Boy. But if you want that extreme retro original style that brings back nostalgic feelings in your head, you can't beat this, really. You really can't. I think like if you grew up in the era where you use this will bring up emotions.
That there are softer ones in more modern handhelds. Either way, I found it very interesting to find that pushing down on a Game Boy button is not that different than it is today. Even when you use something like a PlayStation 5 DualSense controller, it is a very similar feel. And so really, hats off to Nintendo and the other early console makers who basically perfected the feel of.
That's true. Gaming buttons haven't really changed that much.
A rubber membrane button way back 30 plus years ago. Now, when using these start and select buttons, these have a very retro feel to them because they're made out of rubber and very, very mushy. And honestly, I don't really mind it. You don't really push on these buttons very often. And so because of that, it's kind of cool to be able to play a game and be reminded of just how old school things are when you press on the select or start button. Taking a look at the rest of the Game Boy console, we can see that we have a single mono speaker here on the bottom right, and it still sounds pretty good.
And it has a headphone jack as well.
In addition, we do have a headphone jack here on the bottom.
Imagine, right? Like, headphone jacks have been on devices since the 80s, the 90s, right? Even before that. It was more 2.5 than the 3.5 millimeters, and it would be good if they can bring it back. Even though we don't really use headphone jacks because everything's Bluetooth and wireless, it's still good to have it. It doesn't really cost that much to add it back.
Looking on the left, we have a DC power input and then a contrast wheel. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the screen. Up top, we have our power switch. One nice thing about this is that when you turn it on, it'll lock the cartridge into place. Now on the right side, we have a volume wheel as well as our Game Boy Link connector.
Volume wheels. I remember when I was younger, we were playing some games consoles and they would have volume wheels on them. And it's nice. It's like, I have like nostalgic memories, not of the Game Boy, but other units.
Now, in the case I'm using here, this is actually covered up, and I wasn't able to figure out how to actually open it. So I think it may actually just be permanently covered with this third-party case that I'm using here. And finally, looking at the back of the Game Boy, I have that cartridge slot, which again, I'm using with the Game Boy EverDrive. And then below that, we have our battery compartment. Now, I never owned a Game Boy
I think batteries is the best way forward. If they ever had like a rechargeable internal battery, it would have made this worse. Having like, AA batteries inside does something that even the Xbox 360 did, which is that if a battery dies, there's no need to charge it. You can just quickly get new batteries in there and continue. Like if you're on the go, for example, just buy a few batteries on the side and you go like unlimited playing basically. So smart, very, very smart.
Back in the day, but I had friends who did. And I remember that playing this device on batteries was a huge source of anxiety for everybody. Now, a lot of that had to probably do with our age back in the day. I was 9 years old when the first Game Boy came out. And to be honest, back then, getting your hands on AA batteries was next to impossible. I
didn't think about that actually. I think in more today's era, like that every shop has them.
In a house of 7 people, and so batteries were just gone all the time. We had those like punch cards that would allow you to go to Radio Shack and get a battery every month, but other than that, none of us really ever had batteries. However, in today's age, it's a totally different story. For example, you can just buy batteries on Amazon, get 40 of them sent to you in a couple days. Yep. And you can find rechargeable batteries for pretty cheap too. I was also surprised to find that even though I was using generic like CVS batteries here on the device, they lasted all day. In fact, when looking up
Yeah, so the reason why this is the power that is drawn from these old handhelds is not that much. I think you can find more power in a smartwatch than you can find in a Game Boy. I'm not even joking. Like, these don't draw that much power.
Battery life on the Game Boy, they can last anywhere from 8 to 40 hours on one single set. And so I did find it interesting that I had a lot of feelings about how the battery life lasted on the Game Boy, but a lot of that was hung up on my memories and not the actual reality. When it comes down to it, 8 to 40 hours of battery life with 4 batteries is really not that bad, especially considering that this came out over 30 years ago. Next, I want to talk about ergonomics. Now, I had an inkling of how this was going to feel because I have used RetroPie cases that use a similar style. But again, when picking up the Game Boy, I was surprised to find just how chunky and solid it felt overall.
Yeah, this looks nice. Anyway, let's finish this. You guys need to, I don't know, go to bed if you're watching this at nighttime. But should you guys buy this? Should you guys buy the original Game Boy? My answer is this. No. No. The reason why I say that no is that you should only buy it if you really want that nostalgic feeling. If you want to, I guess, get the Game Boy with a lot of games, there is so many other emulation devices that are like half the price of the Game Boy today that you can get that will give you a similar feel for newer hardware, USB-C and all that stuff. And the emulation emulates it pretty closely actually in terms of the original feel. Plus you get a lot more games, newer games as well. I would say only get this if the nostalgic element is deep in you. Deep in you. What do you guys think? Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Peace.